All right, welcome to Poho's Bullpen, where we talk about baseball and sometimes a little bit more. I'm your host, Seth Poho, and with me today on today's episode is writer Danny Gallagher. Danny, thank you for coming on to Poho's Bullpen.
Look at Seth. Thanks a million for having me come on and talk about the greatest sport in the world.
Oh, no doubt, no doubt. And especially from your perspective, I mean, we're going to talk today about your book that you had recently released, Blue Monday, the Expos, the Dodgers, and the home run that changed everything. I know we can't necessarily say this is the 50th season of baseball for the Expos, but it's been 50 years since they came into not only just Major League Baseball, but also came into, or I should say, being a Major League Baseball team entering the Montreal sports culture. It's kind of amazing that you're able to write a book on probably one of the worst days for Expos fans in terms of looking back at their long and illustrious history.
No, that's for sure. The Expos 1981 season was a great season from a season-long standpoint because they
Mm-hmm.
finally made the playoffs for the first time in franchise history. But the actual day, Blue Monday, October 19th, 1981, ranks as probably the worst moment in franchise history because they were just close, so close to the World Series starting in New York the next night that it, and they never really came close to getting into the playoffs after that.
And I can definitely sympathize with Montreal fans in that regard. I mean, I was born in Ohio. My dad grew up in Cleveland. So by birthright, I had to become a Cleveland sports fan. You talk about getting so close to essentially that promised land. I mean, having to endure all those losses by the Cleveland Browns. And, obviously recently the Indians were only one win away from winning a World Series, but couldn't do it in 2016. It is kind of amazing how sometimes those bad days for a sports fan can, in a way, kind of reflect how, sometimes life can be. And I really love the way that, you had that human aspect to your book, Blue Monday, be it talking to not only Rick Monday himself, but also to many players on those Expos teams. What was one of the more interesting or revealing things in your talks with those former players or coaches that you really took away from writing your book?
I think one of them would be Seth talking to Rick Monday about the emotion he expressed when he was rounding the bases and hitting the home run off Steve Rogers, where he pumped his left fist going around first base, and then he was going around second base. He pumped it again, and then you know coming around third base and slapping Danny Ozark's hand, and he was very emotional, and he never really was that emotional of a player. So I asked him, I had to ask him, is there any particular moment, any other moment that where you expressed such emotion in on the baseball field? So he talked about his time. It's a bit of a long story. I try to keep it short, but
Right.
somebody, Johnny Padres, um, when Rick Monday was about 12 years old, Johnny Padres, the Dodgers pitcher, would not give Rick Monday an autograph after a game. And but 7 years later, Rick Monday became a major league player and faced Johnny Padres in a game and got a hit off Johnny Padres. And when Monday got to first base, he shouted at Padres, said, "You didn't sign my ball. You didn't sign my ball." And Padres was saying, "Who the hell is that guy?" So finally, it was then another few years later before Padres and Monday met up at a old timers game or whatever, fantasy camp, and
Yeah.
they shared the story. And that was quite a little anecdote that Rick Monday had never told, I don't think, until he told me, at least not to a writer. So that was a kind of a little nugget that Rick Monday gave me.
And it was interesting because you did note in your book that, obviously that game had been written about a million times. And I imagine, especially within the Canadian and Montreal media specifically, there have been enough stories about it. And you talk about how trying in a way it was to get Monday to talk about it. Who from the Expos side did you have a real issue trying to maybe get information or even trying to just get an interview to talk about that game again?
Yeah, well, see, the late Scott Sanderson, who just died recently of cancer, I wanted to talk to him because he didn't get used much in that series against the Dodgers, and he didn't want to talk to me. But but most of the other guys on the team that were still playing, like Ellis Valentine was traded at the end of May that year, so I still tried to talk to him, but
Right.
he didn't want to talk. But most of the key players, Seth, did talk to me, including Steve Rogers, who we talked for 2 hours on the phone one time, and my right ear was getting pretty hot after the conversation. You know, when you talk with somebody so long, your ear gets pretty hot, and I'm sure Steve Rogers' ear was getting hot too.
No, I definitely know that feeling.
But I had some pretty good cooperation.
It is really interesting, especially with a guy like Rogers. I mean, who, I hate to use that word "go." I mean, since obviously he was the player who gave up that ball, and obviously, as you describe in that, describe in the book, that he was definitely very accommodating to understanding his role in that game. But it's also kind of interesting, in as much as you definitely bring up that it's not just Rodgers' involvement in that game that kind of was a tipping point in that ball game, but also just a bunch of the other decisions made within the game. Obviously, for those who remember watching the game, and I watched it obviously on the internet because I wasn't alive then. But it's like you mentioned about the opportunity about with that double play possibility with that double play early on in the game with Andre Dawson, the decision to use Rodgers instead of Jeff Reardon, and even just the decision going before that game even started the day before when Montreal forced the rain out to postpone it a day so they can give Ray Burris a rest. What was the one thing as that series was happening that really stood out to you in terms of being possibly a tipping point in that series?
You know what? It was the lack of offense for starters. Set in that particular series, the Expos only scored 10 runs in 5 games, and in each of the 3 losses, they only scored 1 run in each game. So now you can't blame Steve Rogers. You can blame on a lack of offense. It's just pretty pathetic. And some of the key players didn't hit very good in that series, and even Andre Dawson admitted to me that he didn't, and to the media after that particular game, that he didn't hit the way he was supposed to. But then, you have Bill Lee and Woody Fryman, the left-handed pitchers in the bullpen waiting to face Rick Monday. I think after the first 2 batters, when Ron Say made the second out with a long line drive to Tim Raines and left it, that's when Jim Fanning should have replaced Rogers with a lefty to face the lefty hitting Rick Monday, and it didn't happen. So I don't know, maybe out of loyalty, he left Steve Rogers in again to face Rick Monday. But Steve Rogers told me his heart was just beating and beating, beating really hard, and he kind of overthrew the sinker, and it got up in the strike zone, and Monday hit it out.
Which is really remarkable considering the fact that, you talk about how the weather was and, it wasn't exactly like playing an afternoon game at Wrigley in August. I mean, the Big O in an October game where it was all wet and cold, you wouldn't really have thought that the most unlikeliest of heroes, Rick Monday, being able to drive a pitch like that. And especially as you mentioned, say just missing on the previous at bat a home run.
As Bill Lee told me, it's an interesting thing. There were almost 3 home runs hit in that inning by the Dodgers. One, he mentioned that Monday snapped a foul ball back from Rogers in behind the seats, and Bill Lee was saying that as if to say if he'd connected, probably would have been a home run. And then he mentioned, say, he almost hit a home run that was held up by the wind. And then, of course, Monday finally hit one out. So Bill Lee, the philosopher and Bill Lee saying that there was almost 3 home runs in that inning. So, but Bill Lee also said that I should have been in there. Bill Lee should have been in there, and that there's no way that Rick Monday would have hit a home run off of him.
Yeah, well, and it's amazing, especially since Lee himself. I mean, I always love what with Lee's little bits there. I mean, especially since he also got noted for giving up, a momentous home run. Because obviously, for a lot of Red Sox fans, think of that Ephus pitch he hung to was it Tony Perez, I think, in the '75 series. Ooh,
Let's
talk
see.
about history repeating itself in a way.
Sure. Yeah,
But
just lots of little stories within the game, Seth, that made that final game interesting.
And it was an interesting season too, and that's the one thing that was really remarkable about reading your book. It's not just about one game. It's, you really led up to that game through the season and even before that season, because let's not forget, 1981 was the split season where you had this really unorthodox idea that you're going to have whoever led their division before the strike, that several week strike was going to be given a playoff spot. And then, of course, with the way the Expos played the second half, they got themselves a second spot along with, you know, two or four other teams. And then you talk about moving Ellis Valentine away from the team, who, let's be realistic. Anybody who was following baseball at that point saw Ellis Valentine as this phenomenal superstar that was just waiting to break out, especially in that outfield. And then you also had Dick Williams, who was managing the club, get fired and then have Jim Fanning replaced. What was probably one of the more interesting aspects of that season leading up to that postseason, in terms of that '81 Expo squad?
Yeah, it's the book is a tribute to the '81 Expos because that was the only time in franchise history that the team made the playoffs. So, and it ends up with the Blue Monday game. But a really big moment was October the 3rd of '81 when Wallace Johnson, the chartered accountant from Gary, Indiana, came up and hit the biggest triple in Expos history to clinch a playoff spot for the Expos at Shea Stadium. So that was a big moment. You know, People think that a star player would have been the likely candidate to have a big hit, but it was Wallace Johnson, a pinch hitter, a part-time player who just called up from the minor leagues that particular year. So it was a big moment for Wallace Johnson. And it's interesting that he told me that that was not the biggest moment in his career. His biggest moment, he told me, was breaking up Ron Robinson's no-hitter with the Reds later on in his career. So, but it was definitely a big moment. One of the biggest moments in Expos history was that two-run triple by Wallace Johnson.
It is always kind of amazing to see a lot of the role players and guys who are coming up on those momentous teams. Because I mean, realistically, I think for a lot of fans, especially for younger fans like me, when you think about the '80s Expos, you think about guys like Gary Carter, you think about Andre Dawson, Tim Raines, you think about those Hall of Famers. But it felt like as if, and I imagine this was maybe the thought, at the time was there were so many good young players, which was really a great thing that the Expos had throughout their entire run as an organization, always having great young players come up. Some of the noted names like guys like Terry Francona, who of course was the big college star joining the team. Tim Wallach was getting his feet wet in there. Bill Gullickson was coming up along with Bryn Smith. And obviously I mentioned Jeff Reardon. Was there, even as the season ended in that disappointment, was there still so much optimism surrounding that team going in from '81 to '82 and beyond because of those young players?
Oh yeah, the core of the team was still there, even though they traded Larry Parrish to the Texas Rangers at the end of spring training in 1982 for Al Oliver. Uh, and David Hostetler went to the Rangers in that trade as well. But they certainly had a great group of players that could really challenge again in '82. And they went down near the end of the season in '82 before they finally lost out. But then, another guy I should be mentioning too is sort of a unheralded player, part-time player was Jerry White. His performance in uh, Game 3 when he hit the big home run off Jerry Rouse to put the Expos ahead of the Dodgers 2 games to 1. That should have been the tipping point for the Expos to really polish off the Dodgers in Game 4. But as I said before, the lack of offense really hurt the Dodgers in that particular series.
It almost felt like as if, in a way, giving that extra day of rest to Fernando Valenzuela was creating a perfect storm. I mean, for anyone to just look at his stats, I mean, he came out like gangbusters in 81. I mean, just out of nowhere. And even though, I mean, if you look at his stats towards August and September, he wasn't pitching as great as he was at the beginning of the year. But man, it's got to be hard to try to, it had to be hard for those hitters to just try to even think about, even in that day off, trying to hit Fernando Valenzuela as it played out.
Uh, you know, it was kind of remarkable that the Expos kind of conspired to try to have that game postponed in order to give Ray Burris more rest, but it gave Fernando more rest. And there's the photograph online of Warren Cromartie during the rainout day on the Sunday, putting his hands up and praying to the sky, hoping that the rain would stop so they wouldn't, so that Fernando would have still pitched on the Sunday with less rest, but maybe wouldn't be as good. But there's so many factors. You talk about Cromartie, another thing, the emotion of the crushing defeat. He was always the flamboyant, exuberant player, stirring up trouble with his teammates and mischief. But after the game, Blue Monday game, he was crushed and crying. And he had told me that one of the similar moments for him was when he was in Little League and he missed one of the bases and the opposing team called it back and they appealed it play and they called him out and he was crushed by that. And it was similar to the crushing defeat in Blue Monday.
And again, I absolutely loved reading your book, Blue Monday, the Expos, the Dodgers, and the home run that changed everything. Looking back at this entire franchise as a whole, it's kind of bittersweet, in my opinion, of looking at that day, that series, that team, that year, because again, as you mentioned, they never had another opportunity to go to the postseason. The '80s, a lot of the star Expo players went to other teams, which obviously made sense, especially as money became more of a huge factor in Major League Baseball. And then, for my generation, I was just a kid when I got into baseball, and that would have been around the time that they had that '94 squad. But there's not really much for Expos fans to really brag about that because, let's be honest. I mean, another strike ended the season and we never got it. Is it almost in a way to say that 81 was kind of like that high watermark for the franchise?
Yeah, they had some great teams from 79 to 82. 79, some people say the 79-80 teams were even better than the one in 81, and even 82 was really good. But certainly that was a big disappointment. Some of the players are saying, okay, there's still another year. We can still time to win something with this squad of players we have. We have a great group, but it never came to pass. And you talk about '94, another strike year, and they had a great team and never realized their potential because the season was called off. And but certainly '81 and '94 were two of the most disappointing years in Expos history, I guess.
And it feels like as if with the way Major League Baseball has been trying to arrange a lot of exhibition games in Montreal, you know, I'd like to hope that in Montreal or at least in Quebec, there's at least some chance and possibility that they can get an ownership group together and not to mention a nice facility for them to make baseball possible again in Montreal.
Oh, for sure. That they've got a great ownership group together. Charles Bronfman, the original owner of the team, has his son Stephen, who has a lot of money, and Mitch Garber, a lawyer. So his ownership group has a lot of money ready to spend. They're not worried about the expansion costs, whether it's $1 billion. They're not, they're just ready to get a team, and they're in constant communication with the Major League Baseball office of the commissioner, Rob Manfred. And I think you're going to see a team in Montreal in a few years, whether it's through expansion. There's always the talk of Tampa Bay moving to Montreal. And Stephen Bronfman was saying the other day at a party for the 50th anniversary of the Expos that he's been told by Major League Baseball to be ready to to have a team. And obviously, they would play a couple of years at Olympic Stadium, Seth, in
Yep.
early going, and then they have to promise Major League Baseball that they would build a new stadium, which they have bought a parcel of land near downtown Montreal to for the stadium. So
Mhm.
Stephen Bronfman's group is really prepared to take on a team.
Phenomenal. And again, I hope it's so soon because I after seeing all those exhibition games that they've been hosting out over there in Montreal, I imagine that team should have no problem drawing fans at the gate. No doubt in my mind.
I think it's a different situation compared to years ago. I think it's the maybe the younger crowd along with the baby boomer older crowd that would combine to make it a good fan base for the Expos.
Again, Danny Gallagher, thank you so much for joining us. Again, his book, Blue Monday, The Expos, the Dodgers, and the Home Run That Changed Everything. It was a fun read. And honestly, like from just reading your words, it just sounded like as if it was a fun team. Again, I wish I was alive back then to be able to follow that club. It was a hoot and a holler to be able to just see those games on YouTube. It's another thing to actually experience it.
Look at Seth. You asked some tremendous, insightful questions, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Hey, I appreciate taking the time to talk with another baseball fan about, again, as you mentioned, the greatest sport known to man.